Why did the cowboy chase a woman into a blizzard after she had already left him behind? Snow slammed against Loretta's face as she stumbled through the darkness, her suitcase dragging a crooked line across the frozen road. Behind her, the wind howled through the pines. Then, somewhere beyond the white curtain of snow, came the sharp sound of a horse whinnying and a man's voice calling her name. She froze. The lantern in her hand shook. What she saw next made her heart stop for a single terrifying beat. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and join us for another unforgettable Western love story. The train pulled into Red Rock just before noon, its iron wheels shrieking against the rails as cold autumn wind swept across the Wyoming plains. Loretta Hayes stepped down carefully, one gloved hand gripping the railing, the other holding a worn brown suitcase that had traveled nearly 2,000 miles with her. Dust swirled around her boots. Beyond the station stretched a frontier town of false front buildings, hitching posts, wagon tracks, and distant mountains painted blue beneath a pale sky. For a moment, her heart lifted. After 8 months of letters, she had finally arrived. Franklin Mercer would be here. He had written about his ranch, about the valley, about building a future together. His words had never been poetic, but they had been steady, reliable. Loretta searched the crowd, a rancher helping unload supplies, a woman carrying a basket, 2 boys chasing each other across the platform. No Franklin. She waited. The station clock crept forward. A freight wagon rattled away. Another train whistle faded into the distance. Still no Franklin. People began to notice. Some glanced at her, then glanced away. Others looked longer than politeness allowed. Loretta sat on a bench near the depot, her suitcase beside her feet. She removed a small photograph from her coat pocket. The edges were worn smooth. Her mother smiled back from another time. "You keep your dignity," her mother used to say, "no matter what the world does." By late afternoon, the sunlight had turned gold. The station agent finally approached. "You waiting on somebody, ma'am?" "Yes, sir," Loretta replied softly. "Franklin Mercer." Recognition flickered across the man's face. "Mercer Ranch." She nodded. The agent hesitated. Then he looked away. Something cold settled in Loretta's stomach. An hour later, she found herself standing outside Molly's Cafe near the center of town. Warm light spilled through the windows. Laughter drifted into the street. And then she heard a familiar name. Franklin. Loretta stopped. Inside, Franklin Mercer sat at a table with 3 other men. He looked exactly like the photograph. Only his expression was different. "I thought she'd be younger," Franklin said with a laugh. The men around him chuckled. "I thought she'd be prettier too." Another burst of laughter. Loretta felt the blood drain from her face. Franklin lifted his coffee cup. "I surely didn't expect the woman who stepped off that train." The laughter grew louder. Outside the window, Loretta stood perfectly still. The wind tugged at her coat. A wagon rolled past. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. But all she could hear was the sound of that table laughing. After a long moment, she turned away. No tears came. Not yet. She simply walked. 1 block, then another. Her suitcase felt heavier with every step. At the far end of the street, beneath the fading evening light, a tall cowboy stood beside a hitching rail. He had seen everything. Grant Holloway watched her walk away without lifting her head. He didn't call after her, didn't step forward. But something about the lonely figure moving through the cold Wyoming dusk stayed with him. By the time Loretta reached the boarding house, the first lanterns were being lit across Red Rock. She paid for a room with trembling fingers, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to sit on the edge of the narrow bed. Outside, wind rattled the window. Inside, silence filled the room. Then came a knock at the door. Loretta wiped her eyes and stood. When she opened it, the cowboy from the street stood there holding his hat in both hands. "My name is Grant Holloway," he said quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grant glanced toward the dark window behind her. "If you don't have anywhere else to go," he said, "Silver Pine Ranch could use someone in the kitchen before winter comes." Loretta stared at him. The day had taken everything she thought her future would be. Yet standing in that doorway, she saw the first small path leading somewhere she had never expected. And neither of them knew that a single decision made that night would change both of their lives. Loretta barely slept. The boarding house mattress creaked every time she turned over. Moonlight slipped through the curtains and painted pale lines across the floorboards. Several times, she almost convinced herself to stay in Red Rock. Several times, she almost convinced herself to leave on the next train east. But each time she remembered the laughter inside the cafe. And each time she remembered the quiet look in Grant Holloway's eyes. Not pity, not curiosity, just a simple offer. By sunrise, she had made her choice. The next morning carried the sharp smell of frost. Grant waited outside the boarding house beside a wagon loaded with feed sacks and supplies. His bay horse stood patiently, steam rising from its nostrils. Loretta stepped outside with her suitcase. Grant removed his hat. "Morning. Morning." Neither said much more. He took her suitcase without asking and secured it beside the wagon seat. The road out of Red Rock wound north through rolling grasslands brushed gold by autumn. Fence posts stretched across the distance. Here and there, cattle grazed beneath a sky so wide it made Loretta feel very small. For several miles, they traveled mostly in silence. Grant seemed comfortable with silence. Loretta wasn't, yet somehow she didn't feel pressured to fill it. Around midday, they stopped beside a creek lined with cottonwood trees. Grant handed her a tin cup and filled it with coffee from a battered thermos. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. Loretta nearly coughed. For the first time, she saw the corner of Grant's mouth twitch. "You'll get used to it." That almost made her smile. By late afternoon, the mountains appeared. Dark green pines climbed steep slopes. Snow rested on distant peaks. The air smelled cleaner here. Then she saw it. Silver Pine Ranch. A weathered house stood near a horse pasture bordered by split-rail fences. A barn sat beyond it. Smoke drifted lazily from a chimney. Nothing grand, nothing fancy. But it felt lived in. Grant helped her down from the wagon. "Room's ready." Loretta followed him inside. The house was neat, not spotless, not decorative, just cared for. A cast-iron stove warmed the kitchen. Copper pots hung from hooks. A ledger book sat on a shelf beside a kerosene lamp. Grant showed her a small bedroom overlooking the pasture. Fresh blankets rested on the bed. A wash basin stood beside the window, and on the door was a brand-new lock. Loretta noticed it immediately. "You didn't have to do that." Grant looked at the lock. "Figured you'd want your own space." Then he left her alone. No lingering, no awkward conversation, just respect. That evening she cooked beef stew from supplies already in the pantry. Nothing fancy, just onions, potatoes, carrots, and beef simmered slowly. Grant ate quietly. After a few bites, he paused. "This is better than what I usually make." Loretta glanced up. "What do you usually make?" "Beans." "Every day?" "Most days." She stared at him. Grant shrugged. For some reason, that made her laugh. The sound surprised both of them. Over the following weeks, a rhythm formed. Mornings began before sunrise. Grant fed horses while Loretta prepared breakfast. Coffee, biscuits, eggs when available. Afterward, she cleaned, mended curtains, organized shelves, and slowly transformed the house into something warmer. One afternoon, she discovered an old rocking chair, leaning crookedly on the porch. She sat in it while watching the mountains. The chair squeaked terribly. 3 days later, she returned from gathering laundry and found it repaired. The joints were tight, the seat no longer tilted. Grant never mentioned it. Neither did she. But she noticed. Another morning, he offered to teach her horseback riding. Loretta climbed onto the mare awkwardly. Grant handed her the reins. "You keep control." The words were simple, yet they stayed with her. You keep control. Not many people had ever given her that choice. As autumn deepened, the ranch began to feel less like a temporary refuge, and more like a place where she could breathe. One Sunday afternoon, a wagon approached from the neighboring property. An older woman climbed down carrying a pie covered with a cloth. Mrs. Beatrice Doyle. Her gray hair escaped beneath her bonnet. Her eyes sparkled with mischief. "So you're the young lady I've heard about." Loretta suddenly felt shy. But within minutes, Mrs. Doyle was chatting as though they'd known each other for years. Before leaving, she pressed the pie into Loretta's hands. Nobody should face a Wyoming winter without friends. That night, after Mrs. Doyle left, Loretta stood on the porch watching sunset spread across the mountains. The sky burned orange and purple. Grant leaned against the rail several feet away. Neither spoke. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Then, days later, they rode into Red Rock with a wagon load of supplies. As Loretta stepped onto the boardwalk outside the general store, she heard two women whispering nearby. One looked toward her, then toward Grant, then back again. That's her, the woman living at Holloway's place. The second woman lowered her voice. But why would he bring her there? The words drifted through the cold air. Loretta pretended not to hear, yet something inside her tightened, because she suddenly understood. Red Rock had not forgotten her, and now the town had found something new to talk about. Loretta kept her eyes on the bolts of cloth stacked near the general store counter. She pretended to study prices while the whispers drifted through the room like smoke. When she stepped back outside, Grant was loading sacks of feed into the wagon. He looked up once. That was all. Somehow, he already knew. The ride back to Silver Pine Ranch was quieter than usual. The wagon wheels bumped over frozen ruts. A cold wind swept down from the mountains. Grant finally spoke. "You don't need to pay attention to town talk." Loretta stared ahead. "I wasn't planning to." But both of them knew she had heard every word. Winter settled across Wind River earlier than expected. Frost coated the fence rails each morning. Thin sheets of ice appeared along the edges of the creek. Business should have been strong. Instead, things began to change. A horse buyer from Casper canceled a contract. A supplier delayed a shipment. 2 ranch hands announced they were leaving after Christmas. Neither gave a clear reason. Grant accepted their decisions without argument. That worried Loretta more than anger would have. One afternoon, she rode into town with Mrs. Beatrice Doyle. While collecting flour at the mercantile, she overheard another conversation. Walter Briggs, the largest ranch owner near Red Rock. The man was standing near the stove speaking to several cattlemen. "Holloway's making poor decisions. Business requires judgment. Investors notice these things." His words sounded polite, yet everyone understood the meaning beneath them. By the time Loretta returned to the wagon, her stomach felt heavy. The snow arrived 2 days later. So did another piece of bad news. Grant sat at the kitchen table studying a folded document while a kerosene lamp burned beside him. The contract for a large horse sale had been withdrawn. Just like that. Months of expected income vanished. Grant folded the paper carefully and set it aside. Then he quietly finished his coffee. Nothing more. No complaint. No curse. That somehow felt worse. The following week, Loretta walked to the south pasture searching for a missing mare. Near the corral, she stopped. Several horses were gone. At first, she thought they had been moved. Then she noticed the empty stall, and another, and another. That evening, she found a receipt tucked beneath the ranch ledger. 3 prized horses sold. The amount listed was far below their value. When Grant came inside, she placed the paper on the table. You sold them. Grant removed his gloves slowly. We needed payroll. Loretta stared at him. Those horses had been part of the ranch for years. She knew it. Everyone knew it. You never said anything. Grant looked toward the window. Wasn't your burden to carry? The answer stayed with her all night. Not your burden. Yet because of her, the burden seemed to be growing heavier every week. Days later, she made a decision. Before dawn, she packed her suitcase. The same suitcase she had carried off the train. A short letter rested on the kitchen table. Thank you for everything. I'm sorry. The ranch deserves better than the trouble I brought with me. Snow fell quietly as she stepped onto the road leading away from Silver Pine Ranch. She did not look back. By sunset, the storm had grown fierce. Wind howled through the pines. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Far behind her, Grant Holloway returned from checking fence lines and found the letter waiting beside a cold cup of coffee. He read it once, then again. For a long time, he stood perfectly still. Finally, he grabbed his coat. Outside, snow whipped across the yard. Mrs. Doyle, arriving with supplies, saw him saddling his horse. Grant, where are you going in weather like this? For the first time since Loretta had known him, something flashed across his face. Not fear, not frustration, something deeper. To find her. Then he rode into the storm. Hours later, somewhere in the white darkness between Red Rock and the mountains, fate was already preparing the next turn in both their lives. Loretta could barely see 10 feet ahead. Snow whipped across the road in endless sheets. The wind howled through the pines and rattled the bare branches overhead. Her coat was crusted with ice. Her gloves were soaked through. She had stopped twice beneath clusters of trees, just to warm her hands enough to keep holding the reins. By nightfall, she reached an abandoned line shack used by ranchers during bad weather. The tiny cabin offered little shelter. A stove, a cot, a stack of old firewood. Nothing more. She lit a lantern and sat alone beside the small fire. For the first time since leaving Silver Pine Ranch, the silence caught up with her. Grant's coffee cup still sitting on the kitchen shelf. The repaired rocking chair. The extra lock on her bedroom door. The way he always stepped aside to let her make her own choices. The memories arrived one after another. Outside, the storm continued to build. Then came a sound. A horse, faint at first, then louder. Loretta rushed to the door. A dark shape emerged through the blowing snow. Grant, or rather, his horse. The animal stumbled into the yard alone. Loretta's heart dropped. The saddle was empty. For a moment she couldn't move. Then she saw fresh tracks leading toward a ravine beyond the trees. She grabbed the lantern. The wind nearly tore it from her hand. Snow stung her face as she followed the trail. 30 yards, 40, 50. Then she saw him. Grant lay at the bottom of a shallow, rocky slope, partially covered by drifting snow. His horse must have lost footing on the icy ground. Grant! She scrambled down. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow. A cut marked one side of his forehead. When she touched his shoulder, he stirred weakly. Loretta. The sound was barely more than a whisper. Relief nearly buckled her knees. Somehow she got him back to the line shack. It took nearly an hour. dragging, supporting, stopping whenever the wind threatened to knock them both down. By the time she finally got him inside, she was shaking from exhaustion. The next 2 days blurred together. Grant developed a fever. His skin burned hot, then chilled, then burned again. Loretta fed the stove constantly, boiled water, changed cold cloths, measured out the medicine she found in the cabin's emergency box. On the third morning, his breathing grew worse. Fear settled heavily inside her chest. Before sunrise, she saddled the horse and rode through the storm toward Red Rock. The journey took nearly 5 hours. Dr. Samuel Whitaker agreed to come immediately. By late afternoon, the doctor was examining Grant beside the fire. "He'll pull through if the fever breaks," the doctor said quietly. "If it doesn't?" The doctor didn't answer right away. Then he simply adjusted his spectacles and looked toward the patient. Loretta understood. That night she remained beside Grant's bed. The lantern burned low. Snow tapped softly against the window. Hours passed. Near midnight, Grant began talking. Not clearly, just fragments. Dreams, memories, words carried away by fever. Then suddenly he spoke her name. Loretta. She looked up immediately. Grant shifted restlessly. His eyes remained closed. Again. Loretta. A long silence followed. Then his voice cracked. Soft. Raw. Honest in a way he never allowed himself to be while awake. "Don't leave me alone again." The words seemed to stop the room. Loretta sat perfectly still. The fire popped softly inside the stove. Outside, the wind faded for the first time in days. Grant never opened his eyes, never knew what he had said. But Loretta heard every word. She lowered her head, and for the first time she understood something she had been avoiding for months. The pain she felt when she left. The relief she felt finding him alive. The fear that had followed her through the storm. None of it had been about gratitude. None of it had been friendship. Somewhere between the train station and the mountains, without either of them noticing, her heart had chosen him. 3 days later, the fever finally broke. The snowstorm moved east. Sunlight returned. Grant gradually regained his strength. The doctor left. Life resumed, at least on the surface. Neither of them mentioned the storm. Neither mentioned the fever. And certainly neither mentioned the words spoken beside the fire. Yet everything felt different. The silences lasted longer. Their eyes lingered a second too long before looking away. Simple conversations carried meanings neither dared speak aloud. One quiet afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the accident, a rider appeared at the ranch gate. He carried a leather mail pouch. Grant was repairing a fence rail when the man handed over an envelope. The handwriting on the front stopped Loretta cold. Franklin Mercer. The man who had left her standing alone on the platform. The man she thought was part of her past. And now, somehow, he had found her again. Loretta stared at the envelope in her hands. The paper was clean, expensive, not the kind usually carried across muddy ranch roads. Grant stood nearby with a hammer resting against his leg. He didn't ask what the letter said. He didn't reach for it. He simply waited. That somehow made it harder. Loretta opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet. Franklin Mercer apologized. He claimed he had made a mistake. He said he regretted what happened in Red Rock. He wrote about new opportunities near the railroad expansion south of town, about land contracts, about prosperity, about a future he wanted to offer her. At the bottom sat one final line. "Come see me at the spring fair. Let's begin again." Loretta folded the letter slowly. Neither she nor Grant spoke for several seconds. Then Grant nodded once and returned to repairing the fence. Nothing else. No questions. No anger. No demand for answers. That silence followed her for days. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the mountains. Snow melted from the lower pastures. Water rushed through the creek behind the barn. Small patches of green returned to the valley. Life at Silver Pine Ranch continued. Breakfast before sunrise. Coffee warming on the stove. The sound of horses moving through the corrals. Yet something had shifted. Loretta often caught Grant looking away whenever their eyes met, and Grant seemed to find reasons to stay busy. A broken gate, a loose board, a saddle that suddenly needed repair. One evening, Mrs. Beatrice Doyle arrived carrying a basket of fresh bread. Older people often noticed things younger people tried to hide. She sat with Loretta on the porch while the sun slipped behind the mountains. "You care about him." Loretta looked down at her hands. Mrs. Doyle smiled gently. "And that stubborn man cares about you." Neither denied it. The spring fair arrived in late April. Red Rock filled with wagons, livestock, merchants, and ranch families from across the county. Colorful banners fluttered above the main street. Children ran between booths selling pies and preserves. Fiddles played somewhere near the livestock pens. Loretta had not planned to attend, but business required it. Grant needed to meet buyers. The ranch needed every contract it could get. So they went. By midday, the fairgrounds were crowded. Then Franklin Mercer appeared. He looked wealthier than before. A new coat, polished boots, a gold watch chain across his vest. He greeted townspeople with easy confidence. Several men gathered around him discussing railroad investments and land surveys. Then he spotted Loretta. For a moment, the noise of the fair seemed to fade. Franklin walked directly toward her. "Loretta." She remained still. Grant quietly stepped back. Not because he was afraid, because the choice belonged to her. Franklin smiled. "I was hoping you'd come." Hours later, near the center of the fairgrounds, Franklin made his move. He spoke loudly enough for nearby people to hear. Then more people gathered. And more. Soon half the town seemed to be watching. Franklin spoke about regret, about second chances, about the future he could offer. Finally, he asked her to marry him. Again. Right there. In the same town where she had once stood alone. A hush settled across the crowd. Loretta looked around. Some faces were curious, others nervous. A few remembered exactly what had happened months earlier. Then she saw Grant, standing near the edge of the crowd, quiet as always, already preparing himself to walk away if that was what she wanted. Something inside her became perfectly clear. Franklin had finally chosen her, but only after deciding she fit the life he wanted. Grant had chosen her when she had nothing. No money, no future, no certainty. Just a suitcase and a broken heart. Loretta stepped forward. "Franklin." Hope flashed across his face. Then she turned away from him, toward Grant. The crowd watched in complete silence. Loretta's voice trembled slightly, but only slightly. "This man never promised me an easy life." Grant froze. "He never promised me wealth." She walked toward him. "He never asked me to become someone else." Grant's eyes never left hers. Loretta smiled through gathering tears. "He's the only man who never made me feel ashamed of being exactly who I am." No one moved. No one spoke. Then Grant removed his hat. For once, he looked completely lost for words. The crowd seemed to disappear around them. Only the two of them remained. Loretta reached for his hand, and Grant held it. Several weeks later, beneath a bright Wyoming sky, They exchanged simple vows in a meadow above Silver Pine Ranch. No grand celebration, no expensive ring, just close friends. Mrs. Doyle, Dr. Whitaker, a handful of ranchers who had come to respect them both. The mountains stood witness. That was enough. 1 year later, laughter drifted across Silver Pine Ranch. The house no longer felt lonely. Flower boxes rested beneath the windows. Fresh curtains hung in the kitchen. The old rocking chair still sat on the porch. Loretta stood watching horses run through the valley below. The afternoon sun warmed the hillsides. Grant stepped outside carrying his hat. Without a word, he settled it gently onto her head to block the sunlight. Loretta leaned against his shoulder. Far below, a train moved through Red Rock. Its whistle echoed across the open country. Once a train had carried her toward Heartbreak. Now it simply passed through the distance. Grant slipped an arm around her. The horses ran. The mountains stood silent. And for the first time in a very long while, nobody was left behind. As I think about Loretta standing there on that porch, watching the train disappear into the distance, I can't help but wonder what any of us would have done in her place. What if the future you crossed an entire country for suddenly vanished? What if the person you trusted turned away, and the only hand offered to you came from someone you never expected? Most of us, at one time or another, have stood on our own version of that platform. Waiting, hurt, unsure whether to keep believing in people. What stays with me about Loretta's story isn't that she eventually found love. It's that she found the courage to stay open to it after disappointment had every reason to close her heart. And what stays with me about Grant is that he never tried to convince her of her worth. He simply treated her as if she already had it. Sometimes healing arrives quietly, not with grand promises, not with perfect words, just a steady presence. A cup of coffee left on a table, a repaired chair on a porch. Someone choosing to stay. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, which moment stayed with you the longest? And if you enjoy stories about second chances, enduring love, and ordinary people finding extraordinary strength, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more journeys waiting down these dusty roads, and I'd be honored to share them with you.